This is one of those videos that would fall more into the philosopher camp than the centrist camp. Um, Thinking of the angle of my channel, centrist philosopher, the centrist bit covers the politics. Philosopher, it's tongue in cheek. I don't see myself as a philosopher, but sometimes I do cover philosophical subjects. And what I want to talk about today is life, really. Life. I mean, I turned 40 on the 1st of September, so that was a marking point for me. And since then, I've tried to keep myself active and busy. I always try to make each day productive, some days more successfully than others, but I've been reflective about my life, and I absolutely, there's things that I regret, there's things that I wish I could have done by now in these 4 decades. But I also know there's things I'm proud of, things that I'm pleased that I did do. Um, what I want to reiterate, for anyone out there who might be going through depression or uncertainty about their own life, obviously everyone's different. Everyone has a unique experience. No, I don't think any two human beings have an exact same experience. But there will be overlap and there'll be people who can empathize because they've been through similar things. But we all have our own journey. Absolutely. Without going into the details, I've had a few awkward situations recently. Things that have, frankly, impacted my confidence a little bit. Now, I'm a reasonably confident person. You'd have to be, I think, to run a YouTube channel. I'm showing my face. I'm putting out my views, frankly, in many cases to total strangers. So that takes a degree of confidence. But truthfully, sometimes when there's awkward exchanges, then that can affect my confidence. And also, disappointments in life can affect one's confidence. So, what I want to underline with this video is that I think when we accept that life isn't a straight line, it makes it a little bit easier to deal with. As an example, you may take a course, some sort of academic course. It could be it could be anything. It could be some sort of specialist subject. It could be an online thing. It could be an adult learning course. It could be anything. Let's say some sort of course which leads to some sort of certificate, and you may not get that certificate. You might drop out of the course. But let's say you do the course and you pass, and then you just haven't found the opportunity to utilize the skills that you gained in that course. And then it might fall through, and you might find that the particular industry you're looking at isn't as straightforward as you thought. And then there's other distractions in life. I don't think there's many people out there that have had a completely smooth path. And I'm not talking here even about unemployment, which is something I have experienced for sure, but even people who've had stable 9 to 5 jobs, I think, have interruptions in life because we all do. So it may be, for instance, I'm just throwing examples out here. They plan to get married, and then things fall through. Maybe there was some tragedy that happened to the fiance, or maybe they realised that that person wasn't for them after all. Maybe someone really envisaged himself in a certain role, and then they just didn't pass the criteria for it, and that shatters that dream that they had. Um, the good thing about the modern world, the contemporary world, is we are overwhelmed with choice in a way. I'm not saying it's always easy. I'm not saying that opportunities come easily, but sometimes I think, in this digital age, this internet age, that the availability of information, the availability of resources, the availability of data, you name it, it's almost overwhelming. But the plus side of that is that we're not we're not kind of forced into a monotonous life. Unless you are really, really being exploited by an employer and they're forcing you to stay. Some jobs obviously have contracts where you have to give notice and so on, and that would be stricter in certain areas. For example, if you're in the military, you can ultimately leave, but it's not as straightforward as just quitting the next day. Um, but regardless, you can still leave. Now, contrast this with the past. People often look back at the past, the good old days, and say, oh, there was never the problems that we have today. But I honestly think every generation has its own challenges. I don't think it's necessarily that the past was much worse or much better. There were things in the past that thankfully we've moved on from now. Infant mortality in the UK has drastically dropped. The sort of diseases that were in British slums in the past, cholera and so on, are non-existent today in this country. We still have poverty in the UK, but is it the sort of extreme crippling poverty you would have got in a Victorian slum? I'm not sure. Um, the life expectancy was a lot lower in the past. There was, that those sort of challenges to life, and yet they didn't have cyber warfare. They didn't have cyberbullying. They didn't have cancers were less because that's, I understand, being linked to additives in food, but I'll tread carefully there because I'm not an expert on the subject. But if you look at the Victorians, there weren't that many people dying from cancer. It tended to be more diseases like typhoid, cholera, smallpox, things like that, rather than cancers. There is fake news today. Now, there would have been fake news in the past. Yellow journalism was infamous. I'm talking about the early 20th century for embellishing things and, effectively making things up. So that would have been the equivalent of fake news. So some things haven't necessarily changed. They've just taken a different format. Anyway, you might think I'm digressing with all this stuff, but I'm talking about the world that we're in, and I'm talking about this path that we take. I think we just have to accept that life is complicated, and even if we make it less complicated, we can go to some forest lodge to get away from things. We can look at minimalism, have minimal distractions. In my case, I like movies, so I have literally hundreds of DVDs. I'm on Netflix. I read papers most days, so I do have a lot of distractions. But that's by choice. That is by choice. If someone were to do that, to go to a remote area, then I think, okay, so they're getting away from the stress of modern life on one hand, but then sooner or later loneliness will start to kick in. Consider the situation of lighthouse keepers in the past. It was known to be a pretty crippling loneliness. They would be months at a time on their own. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we can look at life as being overtly complicated, or we can look at it as that is the norm. That's okay. That's the way it's meant to be. And so if you have disappointments, they're going to vary in terms of how disappointing they are. If you've had a lifelong dream and it's shattered, that's going to be more disappointing than a temporary interest in something that didn't quite work out. I have had big disappointments in life, and that has affected my confidence at times, but I keep going. I'm quite tough. I keep going. But I'm also a reflective person, and I think that we need to just accept that life is not a straight line. You're going to have disappointments. Things are going to not work out exactly as you thought they would. And there's frustrations in life, I personally find it frustrating when something has changed that doesn't need to change. I mean, let me give an example, and this might seem pretty trivial in the grand scheme of things, but my local cinema, it's a wonderful cinema in the interior, Omniplex Sunderland. It looks wonderful inside. It's grand. It's very clean. It looks great. But they only have one real payment method, which is to book it online and they get the QR code. Now I'm just about getting used to it, but I have a basic phone, and to me, why can't you just pay at the counter? You know, so things like that change that I don't think they need to. It's just I do find it frustrating in all honesty. Um, I'll be honest. I've sometimes wondered, could I have autism? Because I know the one characteristic of autistic people, and I've known quite a few autistic people, is they tend to be high intelligence and they tend to be particularly focused and really taking information about certain things. I do have a tendency to do that. Another characteristic that I've heard is that they don't like sudden changes. I don't. I find it stressful. I find it irritating. But then there's other things that might rule me out of that. I've never been tested. I've never, taken that sort of test. But I've sometimes wondered about it. I mean, as far as I know, I'm not autistic, but people that I've known who are, I have some similarities in my personality to those people. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe people watching this channel might wonder about that. Well, the answer is I don't know because I've never taken the test. If it turns out that I was, I'd be a little surprised, and I don't know how I'd feel. I don't think it would really change anything, to be quite honest, in terms of how I approach things. I'd be a little surprised because I don't think I necessarily have the. I mean, for instance, and if you're autistic or please correct me if I'm wrong about this. But my understanding is one thing with autism is people who have autism don't always pick up on social signals. I'm not saying that to be disparaging. It's just something that I've heard. Well, I tend to be quite assertive when I'm in a social situation in the sense that I can talk to someone and I'll be talking, but I will listen as well. And it's so I don't know if that differs or not, because I tend to be assertive in those situations as opposed to being not knowing social cues. I mean, I don't say inappropriate things, or I don't know. This isn't intended to be judgmental in any way at all. I'm just speaking openly here. I wonder. I've wondered sometimes, do I have it? But anyway, back to the point of the video. That straight line I keep mentioning, it doesn't exist. Life's a zigzag. And even the most hardworking, determined, ambitious people are going to have disappointments. You can think of some very successful people. I guarantee they'll have had some disappointments. Now, it may seem that they have more to show for their life than others, and some people are simply more successful than others. That's the reality. But I think everyone has disappointments, and I know at 40 there's things that will be harder for me to do now than when I was 25. Not impossible, but just because there's more of a priority for younger people. And the opportunities won't necessarily come to a 40-year-old the way they would to a 25-year-old. I mean, I'm all for giving young people opportunities, but I don't think it should be restricted to young people. Very often you hear young people age 18 to 35 or 18 to 30, there's opportunities, and I'm that's great, but there are people in early middle age or older millennials who are also need opportunities. So I don't think it should be restricted just to one age group. Anyway, I will wrap this up, but wherever you are in life, maybe you're very happy in your job, maybe you're unhappy, maybe you're disappointed, maybe you're at a point in your life where you don't know what the right decision is. I do sometimes struggle, in all honesty, with direction. I know what I believe in, I'm very opinionated here. I know what I believe in, but in terms of direction for my own life, there's things I want to do, and I'll keep pushing. I'll keep moving forward. But life is a zigzag. It is not a straight line, and we need to accept that. There will be disappointments, and we have to just accept the fact some things work out. You may do something. You may, be taking a course for 6 months, training for 6 months, and then for reasons beyond your control, you're rejected, or it doesn't quite pan out, and that is hard. But maybe that's just destiny. Maybe it's just the way it's meant to be. We can look at it as, okay, that's wasted time, or it was an experience, it was just another part of my life at that time, so what? It doesn't define who you are. It doesn't define your whole life. At least it shouldn't. So I hope people can relate to this video. I hope they know what I'm driving at. But life is a zigzag. It is not a straight line, and we need to be okay with that. I think one last thing I'll say, and I'm saying this to myself as much as anyone, I think we have to not overly organize our lives. It's good to be prepared for things. It's good to be tidy. It's good to be, organized. Of course it is. But the problem with doing that excessively is we'll inevitably let ourselves down. So, if you make a 5 year plan or a 10 year plan, almost guaranteed it won't go exactly to that plan. So you need backup plans. You need to just accept that it is not going to work out as smoothly as you hope. Of course, some things will happen for you. There's no reason they can't. But I know for a fact I've had disappointments, and I also know there's things that I've tried out that I wasn't sure about, and then they were wonderful and good experiences. And I would not have taken on those things. Sometimes it's being encouragement from others, I have to say, but the point is I did do it. So we just need to accept that life is a zigzag. As long as we're not selfish, as long as we respect ourselves, um, that's it. I mean, we just need to accept it. Let me know your thoughts.